One fight can change everything for a mixed martial artist in the top flight. But for these 10 fighters, they did not allow a brutal defeat to define their legacy, and their perseverance saw them rebound in strong form to regain some of the momentum they had lost. Now, without further ado, and ranked in no particular order, here are 10 fighters who bounced back from brutal defeats. Number 10. Robert Whittaker. Something was clearly off about Robert Whittaker when he first fought Israel Adesanya. A long layoff and a career-threatening illness had passed before the Reaper was able to follow up the 10 rounds he spent with Yoel Romero. But on that night, at UFC 243, Israel seemed to have his number, and in the second round he capitalized on his clear striking advantage, TKOing the champion to win the belt. But Bobby Knuckles would not be so easily thwarted.
This is my first long loss in the division. Trust me when I say I'm not going anywhere.
And though many were counting him out, the former champion went 3-0 over Darren Till, Kevin Gastelum, and Jared Cannonier, re-establishing himself as the top contender. And sure, he lost the rematch to Adesanya, but let's be clear, it was a lot closer than the first. In fact, many of us actually scored it in favor of Whittaker. That's a strong fighting spirit right there, folks. Number 9. Jose Aldo. Many people were ready to count out Jose Aldo when his decade-long run of form came to a shocking end. Aldo wasn't that old in years. The miles on his engine would surely result in a very clear decline. But time and time again, he bounced back. First, by putting on a career-best technical display against a very game Frankie Edgar at UFC 200. But even more impressive than that was his ability to rebound once more from a loss to Max Holloway, with finishes of Renato Moicano and Jeremy Stephens, and then craft an entirely new chapter for himself at bantamweight after he was stifled by the future featherweight champion Alexander Volkanovski. Aldo was one of the most dominant champions in MMA history in his prime, but his reputation as a comeback king also deserves to be celebrated. Number 8. Daniel Cormier. It can't have felt good to be Daniel Cormier after UFC 214. Losing to a rival is hard enough, but when that rival is Jon Jones, and he managed to finish you with a brutal head kick, Cormier was definitely in a tough spot.
Oh man, I'm so disappointed.
But when it emerged that Jones had tested positive for a banned substance, all of a sudden DC was reinstated as champion. So what did he do? Well, after rebounding with a win over Volkan Ozdemir, Cormier decided to leave Jon Jones in the past in favor of a move to the heavyweight division. And though most people were ready to write him off, Cormier proceeded to knock out the divisional great Stipe Miocic, finishing him in the opening round at UFC 226, becoming double champion in the process. How's that for stepping out of the shadow of your nemesis?
I never knew what I could become, but tonight I got the answer. I'm a two-division champion, baby!
Number 7. Henry Cejudo. It seems like an eternity ago now, but Henry Cejudo's first shot at UFC gold did not go well. Facing the longtime champion Demetrius Johnson, Cejudo was well and truly destroyed in that fight. Johnson used some knees in the clinch to break Cejudo's form, eventually getting him out of there in the opening round. Then he lost a close decision to Joseph Benavidez shortly after, leaving him in a pretty tough spot within the 125-pound mix. But Cejudo is no normal fighter, and after switching up his approach to striking in favor of a more karate-like stance, he scored back-to-back victories, eventually earning a rematch with Demetrius Johnson and beating him over 5 rounds. His last 6 fights ended up establishing him as a 2-division champion and one of the all-time greats within the lower weight classes.
My name is Triple C, Olympic champion, flyweight champion of the world, and now bantamweight champion of the world. I am the greatest combat athlete of all time.
Still, it's pretty wild to think about how easily Mighty Mouse dealt with him in their first fight. Number 6. Rose Namajunas. Despite her most recent loss, Rose Namajunas has had one impressive career. After losing in the very first title fight at 115 pounds, she slowly ascended through the ranks, eventually pulling off a historic upset over the legendary Joanna Jędrzejczyk, courtesy of a first-round TKO. And to prove it was not a fluke, she repeated the feat in the rematch, this time by decision. But just when it seemed like Thug Rose was headed for superstardom, Jessica Andrade beat her out of nowhere by slamming her directly on her head in a truly bizarre finish. That type of loss can really shake a fighter's confidence. But Namajunas would not be discouraged. Instead, after taking some time off, she returned and beat Andrade over 3 rounds before finishing Zhang Weili with a head kick to recapture her title, becoming the first fighter in women's MMA history to win back a title they had once lost. Number 5. Dustin Poirier. Sometimes a brutal defeat is enough to really put certain things into perspective. And for Dustin Poirier, getting mentally outgunned,
his chin is deteriorating, a gust of wind and he does the chicken dance,
and then knocked out by Conor McGregor at 145 pounds was enough to make him realize that something needed to change. Firstly, it was clear that he had allowed himself to get too emotional during the lead-up to that brutal defeat.
Boy, you ain't I've never disliked somebody that much that I've ever fought.
But secondly, and this was potentially just as important, his weight cut down to the featherweight limit was clearly starting to hinder him. Armed with this knowledge, the Diamond stepped up to lightweight, defeating several of the division's best, eventually earning the interim belt and even challenging twice for the undisputed title. Jump forward a few years to UFC 257, where Poirier rematched McGregor, and it was clear that Dustin was a different man. And sure enough, he went 2-0 over the Irishman in a pair of confident performances, putting all the memories from that first loss to rest. Number 4. Francis Ngannou. Francis Ngannou apparently hits with the force of a Ford Escort traveling at full speed, or at least that's what Dana White was telling us in the lead up to UFC 220, prior to his title clash with the heavyweight champion Stipe Miocic. Ngannou had all of the hype coming into that fight, so much so that it became very clear that a large portion of the fans and media were overlooking the prowess of the champion.
Do you feel like you've gotten your fair shake in this whole thing?
No,
because he's getting much more promotion. They are hyping him more than they're hyping you, Stipe.
Good for him.
So, when Stipe dominated Francis over 5 rounds, it seemed like the Predator had really dropped the ball. Factor in his awful performance in his matchup against Derek Lewis, and it looked like this hype job was headed for the where are they now section. But Ngannou was cut from a different cloth. And although it took him quite some time to recapture the public's faith, 4 straight knockouts and an eventual finish of Stipe Miocic in their rematch signaled to the world that he was, in fact, as special as we originally thought. Number 3. Justin Gaethje. Despite his sensational UFC debut against Michael Johnson, we all thought that Justin Gaethje had been figured out when he went 0-2 against Eddie Alvarez and Dustin Poirier in back-to-back appearances. Not only did both of those result in a knockout, but his loss to Eddie Alvarez in particular was pretty hard to watch, ending with a vicious knee to the face.
I didn't get in the sport to win or lose. It's an entertainment factor for me, and I will be known as and remembered as one of the most entertaining fighters that ever did it.
Sure, he was exciting as hell, but the highlight was showing himself to be too one-dimensional to succeed at the highest level, or at least that's what we thought. But Gaethje then went back to the drawing board, re-emerging as a far more methodical and dangerous fighter. 4 straight finishes followed, including one drawn-out beating of Tony Ferguson that totally changed our perception of him. A fan favorite, sure, but easily one of the best lightweights as well. Number 2. Charles Oliveira. We could have easily zoned in on several of Charles Oliveira's career moments for this list, but it was his lightweight loss against Paul Felder that really stands out. Oliveira, who is, of course, known for his wild submission skills off of his back, was KO'd by Felder with some brutal elbows as the Irish Dragon sat in his guard. To pull off a knockout like that in a position as dangerous as that really shows how good Felder was. But for DuBronx, it was pretty fair to say that he had hit a major wall. But even if the fans were losing faith, Oliveira would not be so easily thrown off course. He went back to the drawing board, scored 3 straight submissions the following year, and then went on a run that eventually led him to UFC Gold. 11 fights after losing to Paul Felder, and we were having a totally different conversation about Charles Oliveira, a career turnaround for the ages. Number 1. George St-Pierre. When discussing the greatest fighters of all time, George St-Pierre usually sits at number 1 or 2 on that list. However, even a great like St-Pierre wasn't invincible. In fact, he suffered a pretty brutal setback earlier in his career when he faced off against Matt Serra, who pulled off one of the greatest upsets in MMA history by knocking out St-Pierre in the opening round. Of course, this would turn out to be the final loss of his career, and a setback he was all too eager to avenge. After earning consecutive wins over Josh Koscheck and Matt Hughes, GSP earned a rematch with Matt Serra at UFC 83, and this time he dominated Serra in front of his home crowd in Canada, getting him to the ground and then finishing him with a barrage of knees to the body. This win also paved the way for a historic win streak, which saw him become the most dominant welterweight champion in UFC history, and even capture the middleweight title as well. As always, if you guys enjoyed the video, please be sure to let me know by leaving a like and subscribing to our channel. Apart from that, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.